Let's pray. Let the words of my mouth and the meditations of our hearts be acceptable to you, O God, our rock and our redeemer. Amen. Something will happen. Over a decade ago, a great friend of mine shared this phrase with me. This friend is quite possibly the freest spirit I have ever known in just about every way possible. She has been known to hop on her bike and ride across the continent from Canada all the way south to Mexico, just randomly finding farms and communities along the way where she can rest and offer different kinds of help to those who house her. I, on the other hand, have been one who loves the idea of stability. I've often stressed out about making sure I had enough money to pay bills and to have food to eat. And when any of that changes, I begin stressing in advance of the actual time in which changes happen. I have worried more than my fair share about having a plan with a backup plan and a backup plan of that backup plan. So when my friend and I would get together, eventually the conversation would go down the path of my talking about future plans with her, wanting to get some sense of the adjustments that I needed to make to accommodate those plans. When I'd ask her about whether she'd participate in these plans, she'd just shrug her shoulders and say, "Something will happen." And she'd sit back while I would get all sorts of worked up and frustrated at her lack of commitment one way or another, and maybe even just a bit upset, right, at what felt like a flippant answer. And then she'd respond again, "Something will happen. Something always does." Many years later, as an older and slightly wiser adult person, I finally was able to have an appreciation for this refrain, "Something will happen." It is so painfully obvious and almost empty if you look at it in the way I did over a decade ago. But in these last few years, it has been sort of a go-to phrase for me whenever difficult situations arise. I've learned the hard way to not throw it around as freely as my friend did. I was a lot kinder to her in my frustration than some folk have been to me when I casually drop that phrase in conversation. So I probably maybe need to fine-tune my wisdom just a little bit, so I can be a bit more selective about when and how I share it. But there is this certain level of peace that comes with knowing that no matter what I do or don't do, something will happen. Even if I know that the something that'll happen may not be what I desire, right? For me, it has become shorthand for saying that the world is so much bigger than my individual experiences. And while I know that my experiences matter and are added to the experiences of the whole, the phrase, "something will happen," helps me keep things in perspective. And even more than that, though, the real piece in calling up this phrase is my knowledge and trust that God is in all things. In every situation, God is already there. In the highest heavens or in the lowest lows, I trust that our human experiences do not occur without God in the mix. Now, please hear me. I'm not at all saying that God causes suffering or turmoil or the struggles that we experience, but rather that God is there with us as we get through the hard stuff. The phrase reminds me that not only does the world continue to spin, even in my deepest sufferings, but God is present in my own experiences as well as in the experiences of others. I can almost hear Paul saying this to his friends and colleagues in Philippi. "Hey y'all, look, something will happen." When Paul is writing to the Philippians, he was in Rome, awaiting trial in prison. He didn't know what would happen to him. For all he knew, this time around would be the death penalty. We can see in his writing throughout this letter that he seems to be preparing just for that. He writes as if he may not be continuing with them in ministry. I love the way he writes this letter, though. It speaks of a people who have been faithful all along. It addresses a people who will now have to reimagine what it means to be Christ's followers, perhaps without his leadership. They too were facing their own struggles. But Paul writes this letter to encourage their continued faithfulness to the cause of Christ. He appeals to them to be steadfast in their unity in the face of some relational breakdowns, oppositions, and potentially false teachings. He urges them to carry on and to stand firmly in the Lord. For us living in this day and age, we could certainly use some of what Paul shares with the Philippians. We have intense struggles in our individual lives and even on a local and national and global level. When we hear about the hate and violence perpetuated by people who tack God's name onto it, it is hard to remain unified in the face of these relational breakdowns, oppositions, and even false teachings. As Paul urges them to keep at it and to stand firm in God's real message, rooted in love and radical hospitality, so I urge each and every one of us to do the same. In the face of fear, we can choose love. In the face of hate, we can choose radical hospitality. And even when we don't choose well in every single moment of our lives, something will happen. So let's hear again these words of Paul. I thank my God every time I think of you. In every prayer I utter, as I plead on your behalf, I rejoice at the way you have all continually helped promote the good news from the very first day. And I am sure of this much, that God, who has begun the good work in you, will carry it through to completion, right up to the day of Christ Jesus. It is only right that I should entertain such expectations about you, since I hold all of you dear, you who are all partakers of grace with me, even when I lie in prison or am summoned to defend the solid ground on which the good news rests. God knows how much I long for each of you with all of the affection of Christ Jesus. My prayer is that your love may abound more and more, both in understanding and in wealth of experience, so that with a clear conscience and blameless conduct, you may learn to value the things that really matter up to the very day of Christ. It is my wish that you be found rich in the harvest of justice which Jesus Christ has ripened in you, to the glory and praise of God. First Congregational United Church of Christ, this is my prayer for us as well. Let us love and extend the most radical of welcomes when the world around us will have us believe fear and hate and exclusion are the way. When life makes a mockery of our plans and wishes for how the world can be, let us find comfort in and with each other, trusting that God can and will accompany us in all that we encounter. Wherever and however we find ourselves today, let us rest assured that something will happen. Let's find peace in knowing that whatever that something may be, God already has, already is, and always will be in it. May it be so. Amen.